Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox Recording here to share with you my top 3 tips for achieving wider mixes. Now, I've come to realize over the years that I've been doing this when interacting with some of my students and also people online is that a lot of people believe that you need to use some fancy pants technique in order to achieve nice wide mixes. I often hear people talk about MS processing and also using fancy stereo widener plugins, and I'm here to tell you that you don't need to mess with all of that stuff. I find that the best results really come from getting your mix right at the source. And in order to do this, you do not need anything fancy, just a basic DAW and a handful of plugins, nothing more. So without any further ado, I'm gonna play a sample back and then I'm gonna dissect piece by piece how I achieve this nice wide sounding mix and my top 3 tips on how to help you achieve the same results within your home studio. So let's check it out. Okay, so as you could probably tell, there's a bunch of stuff happening in this mix. Heavy guitars, busy drums, busy bass parts, strings, vocals, vocal layers, a lot of stuff. But in my opinion, there's a lot happening, but it still sounds clear and wide. And to be honest with you, it took nothing extraordinary or fancy to achieve this result. And I'm gonna reveal to you my top 3 tips so you can achieve a very similar result. Tip number 1. Focus on utilizing an LCR mixing approach. Now, if you're not familiar with the LCR method of mixing, the idea is very simple. The idea is that you pan most or all of your instruments either hard left, in the center, or hard right. Now, I do not follow this philosophy 100%, but I find that by following it about 80% is awesome for multiple reasons. One, by default, by hard panning most of your instruments and keeping certain instruments in the middle, you automatically will achieve a wider sounding mix. But the other great thing about this is because you're panning so many instruments on the left and right and keeping certain ones in the middle, you have extra space in between. So in other words, instruments like toms, certain overdubs will have space in some of those in-between spaces, like that 50% on the left or right, or that 75% or whatever. You'll have that extra room. Now, the reason why I bring this up is I found that a lot of times when people show me their mixes or send me their DAW sessions, there's a lot of panning going on in the not hard left and hard right and middle. In other words, a lot of times people will pan their guitars in, they'll have their vocals not hard panned if it's a special effect, they'll pan a delay like 50% to the left, just weird stuff like that. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing if you want a smaller sounding mix, and certain genres do not call for huge, massive sounding mixes. For example, one of my good friends is into a lot of indie rock, and one of his criticisms about my mixes is that they're too big and they're just too wall of sound like. But for me, I can't get enough of that. I like a nice, huge, big sounding mix. And again, in my opinion, one of the best ways to get there is to not be shy with your panning. So for example, let's break down some of the tracks in this mix. I have my kick up the center, snare sample up the center, live snare up the center, snare bottom, centered. My rack tom is panned 30% to the right, floor tom is panned 80% to the left. Now my overheads are hard panned. That's another thing. I find that a lot of people don't hard pan their overheads. And here's the thing, we gotta remember that they're recording the exact same source. So unless your overheads are miles apart, you might as well hard pan them. I found that when I pan my overheads in slightly, I'm never too crazy about the results because again, they're recording the same source. So I end up with just a narrower sounding drum sound. It's not like when I pan them, they're overly wide. So in my opinion, you might as well pan your overheads wide unless again, you're recording a massive, and I mean a massive kit where the cymbals sound too separate, but that's rarely an issue. Again, my china is panned hard left, my ride is panned hard left, my hats are panned hard right, and my rooms are panned hard left and right. Because again, all of these microphones are recording the same source. So in other words, having your cymbals sound too separate and too wide is never really an issue. Okay, from there I have my bass and my bass DI. They're both being sent through a mono sub, which is panned center. And here we have my rhythm guitars, and they are both panned hard left and right. I get this question a lot. A lot of people seem to think for some reason that they should pan their guitars in slightly. Now, if you are quad tracking, sometimes this can help where you hard pan your main left and right tones and then slightly pan guitars 3 and 4 in a bit. But for me, I'm not even really a fan of quad tracking in the first place. I just find that a tight guitar performance on the left and a tight guitar performance on the right with a great tone is all I need. And again, I always hard pan my rhythm guitars. Okay, my lead guitars are right up the center because they are the guitar solo. Now my 2 mono vocals are up the center. I do have a stereo effect on one background vocal, and that stereo effect is panned hard left and right. And I do have one of the vocal overdubs that just pops in for a second, panned about 60% to the right. So for me, this particular track was one of the few exceptions where there was a nice open space in that part of the stereo spectrum, and I felt like it fit nicely there instead of panning it in the center or the hard right. But again, so far, most of these instruments are center, hard left, or hard right. Now, here are my string tracks, and because they're in the background and all of these strings were recorded separately, I did not want them to sound too wide. Remember, my guitar is already sounding nice and wide, my drums are sounding wide, so I've decided to take the strings and actually pan them in a smidge. This is another example of that 20% of the instruments where you can pan them in a little. But again, most of your main instruments, 80% of your mix, are hard panned, following that LCR approach. Okay, my synths, hard panned, and my special effects are all hard panned. So as you can see, roughly 80% of my mix is either hard left, hard right, or up the center. In other words, mainly an LCR style mixing approach. Now I've heard of guys taking this to the extreme and only using hard left, up the middle, and hard right and achieving great results. Me personally, I found that using mainly an LCR approach gives me the nice wide results that I'm always after. And this leads me to tip number 2, not letting too many instruments live in the low end. Now you might be wondering, what the hell does this have to do with width? And the truth is that low end, for the most part, is omnidirectional. In other words, it's hard for us to discern where our low end is coming from as human beings. This is why you'll always find that the bass guitar is panned in the center, kick drums, because it makes sense. Now for me, the only other instruments outside of the kick and the bass that I allow a little extra low end in are the rhythm guitars and the toms. That's it. If we look at my string tracks, not shy with a high pass filter, just getting rid of all of that extra low end, because again, if I let this low end live in these overdubs, they're not only gonna clash with my low end instruments, but they're gonna really narrow the spectrum of my mix. That's because if you have tons of low end on the sides of your mix, you're gonna end up with a narrower sounding mix, and it's just not necessary. So by keeping my overdubs and my strings, lead guitars, vocals nice and thin, my mix will naturally be wider because there's not too many instruments fighting in that range, that omnidirectional range. And if we look at my cymbals, yep, tons of low end taken out of the cymbals. My vocals, ton of low end taken out of my vocals. This way my rhythm guitars can have a little extra low end, as well as my toms. A real world example of what I'm talking about is if you have a subwoofer, whether it's on your recording rig or in a room, you can pretty much have it placed anywhere within reason within the room, and it really won't make a huge difference because low frequencies are omnidirectional. So again, if you have a ton of low end information happening in every which way in your mix, it's gonna narrow the sound of your mix, and not only that, it's really gonna muddy up the sound of your mix. And I found that a clearer mix is often a wider mix. So remember, only let a few instruments live in that low end. And this brings me to tip number 3. Stop recording so many tracks. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to the busiest section of this song. I'm gonna play the chorus back where there's a lot going on. And let's take a listen to the size of this mix. Let's check it out. Okay, so in my opinion, that's a pretty big sounding mix. It's wide, there's a lot going on, but nothing is stepping on top of one another. Now, I didn't use any stereo wideners, no fancy MS processing, nothing. Just common sense when it came to choosing the tracks that exist within my mix. And again, there's drums happening, bass, guitars, vocal overdubs, strings, a synth, and I've kept this entire production within a 29 track limit. Not 50 tracks, not 100 tracks, 29 tracks. Now, I'm not saying that you should arbitrarily choose some track limit and stick strictly within that track limit, but remember, when you're producing your music, ask yourself if certain overdubs really belong in the song. And if they do, ask yourself where they should belong. So for example, in this song, the strings only kick in throughout the chorus. If these strings are happening throughout the verses, pre-choruses, not only would it lose the effect of making the chorus pop, but in my opinion, it would really make my mix sound smaller because it would just be too hectic and unfocused sounding. Believe me, it's much easier to achieve a wide, fat sounding mix when each track has its own purpose and place, not only within the production, but sonically. Now, if you have some experience, I know these tips might sound overly simplistic and really straightforward. But people ask me this question often, and more often than not, when I crack open someone's session within their DAW, it's usually these three things. There's not enough LCR happening, not enough hard panning happening, too much low end happening on the sides and instruments that just do not require it, and just way too many tracks that do not belong in the production in the first place. I know it's very tempting to just keep adding and adding, especially when you're sitting in your home studio and you can just go bonkers. But believe me, it's not the way to a wider, bigger mix. It's a way to a cluttered, smaller sounding mix. Now, I just want to drive this point home. A huge sounding mix, I know, is not always the answer. This is genre specific. I work primarily in the hard rock and extreme metal genres. And in those genres, clients generally want huge, massive sounding mixes. If you're working with R&B, indie rock, or whatever, in those cases, maybe you do want a little extra low end on the sides. Maybe you do want to pan things in a little. But for the stuff that I do and the stuff that you probably do if you're watching this channel, this is the way to go. So I'm curious to know, are wider mixes something that you struggle with? Leave a comment in the comment section below and tell me all about it. I'd love to hear your opinion. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. You can both like and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the description below. And be sure to download my 5-step guide to better heavy mixes so you can achieve better results with the gear you have right now. There's a link below right within this video's description. Till next time, happy mixing.